Hello everyone, welcome back to Exploration Arcanum. My name is Jason. Today is a special day. It's the 109th birthday of John Whiteside Parsons, also known as Jack Parsons. Co-founder of JPL, Jack was a rocket scientist, an occultist, and a dreamer. I'm going to play for you a 2019 interview I did with George Pendle, author of Strange Angel, The Otherworldly Life of rocket scientist John Whiteside Parsons. This interview was recorded after the season 2 finale of Strange Angel, the Paramount Plus CBS All Acess show that unfortunately marked its series finale as well. I hope you enjoy, subscribe to the channel and the podcast, and if you haven't already, pick up a copy of Strange Angel today. George, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, when you first began writing the book, were you aware of Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley, and the Thelema when you first started, or is that something that you found out over time?
No, I really wasn't familiar with any of it. I mean, I had a slight knowledge of Aleister Crowley just because he is, such a kind of countercultural hero. He's on the cover of Sergeant Pepper, so I knew that, and I knew that he was known as the wickedest man in the world. But that was really it. He was really nothing more than a kind of symbol for the occultist in the 20th century, kind of. But as for Jack Parsons, I didn't know anything about him, and I didn't know anything about Thelema either. Really, I got into it by through journalism. I'm a journalist by trade, and I was writing a piece on Kenneth Anger, who's an experimental filmmaker.
Right.
I was commissioned to do this by my editor, and I was looking into Kenneth Anger, and it turned out that Kenneth Anger, in one of his films, had this woman called Cameron, who appeared in one of his 50s films, a film called Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome.
Right, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, and so I kind of, I was looking into it, and I read in some book of avant-garde film, it was just like a little footnote saying Cameron was married to the occultist rocket scientist Jack Parsons. And that was kind of it. And I was like, wait, there's got to be more to it than that. And so I started looking, and I looked around. I looked in Mike Davis's great history of LA, which is called City of Quartz. And there was a bit more about Jack Parsons and a little bit about L. Ron Hubbard at the same time.
Right.
And then I was looking around. It was really kind of scratching all this stuff from the corners. And eventually, it wasn't for some time. It was about 6 months in that I found this book, Sex and Rockets, which had been written about Jack Parsons back in the 90s. And it was, it was good in that it had more about Jack Parsons than I'd ever seen anywhere else.
Right.
But it was also kind of freighted with a lot of hearsay and a lot of rumor, and I didn't think it was written particularly well. And at the end of it, I didn't really get an idea of who Jack Parsons was. And so my idea was to kind of, using a journalistic approach, kind of cut through all this thicket of rumor and hearsay and kind of all this kind of unknown story of Jack Parsons and try and figure out what actually happened.
Sorry. No, that's a great point, because the group that I'm in, there's a Facebook group dedicated to the show, and one of the questions was your book Strange Angel versus Sex and Rockets, and your book was a basis for the show, but what a lot of members of the group pointed out was the show tended towards the sensational. So it was a wonder of, did they try to blend the two books together in order to make something that was sellable? They could, because if you watched any of the interviews, the main point that people talked about was the sex and magic, right?
Right.
And they made it, and the billboards, big letters, sex, magic, and rocket science, right?
Right. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So, but what I liked about your book is that your book actually came across as, this is Jack Parsons, not this is Jack Parsons, but look, we're about to have an orgy,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, I know what you're saying. I mean, in my book, there's still plenty of sex magic. I mean, that's something that's undeniable that Jack Parsons took part in. But no, what I was trying to do was write a non-fiction account and basically have proof for everything.
Right.
So basically, every little fact that appears in my book, of which there are many, is either, has some interview, or it has an oral history, or it has, a document that refers to it, which Sex and Rockets really did. I thought it was fine, and it allowed the author to kind of hypothesize a lot, but I wanted to really bring it back down to reality. And the thing is, bringing Jack Parsons' story back to reality doesn't make it any less strange.
True.
It's equally weird if you're using, if you're basing everything on what happened.
True.
So that was really it. I mean, as for the TV show being more sensational, I mean, there's no doubt it is. I mean, it's not, a biography like my book was. I very much, wanted my book to be watertight when it came to what happened. I would say what I knew, what I didn't know, I also said.
Right.
And I think because TV shows, and dramas in particular, demand actual stuff happening. They demand a kind of through thread of a narrative. Then they've kind of pieced together various hypotheses. I don't know if they've read Sex and Rockets or not, but definitely some of the hypotheses that come out of Jack Parsons' story appear in the TV show. I think so. I mean, I don't particularly begrudge them that. I know they're making a drama, and it's something different to the book. And a lot of what they do, I think, a lot of what they hypothesize, like the actual life of Jack Parsons in his, in his house amidst the cult. I think I have a feeling it must be true. There are certain aspects of it which ring so true and seem so realistic.
The TV show, as opposed to the book, seems like it's merging people into composites. For example, Richard Onstead, who is working with Jack in the TV show, is more than likely Frank Molina, who is his real life partner, and the professor, who is what's his name, Musalim, in the TV show.
Yeah.
I forget the name of his real professor, the one that brought them into Caltech.
That would have been Von Karman.
Von Karman, yes.
Theodore Von Karman,
Theodore Von Karman, yes. And so looks like they were hodgepodging people together, which was kind of off-putting at first, because my idea was, well, why would you need to do that? I can see them doing that with someone like L. Ron Hubbard, because there's additional baggage that goes along with that name. But, why didn't you call Helen Parsons, right? Right,
yeah.
And
I think I can't really answer, I can't really answer for the filmmakers. I've really not been involved in the TV process very much at all. This most recent season, they sent me a few scripts in advance to kind of, take a look at, but I'm not really involved in any of the writing for it. But I would imagine that the composite, like you say, the Richard Onstead character, he's a bit Frank Molina, he's a bit Ed Foreman.
Right.
And I think the idea is just to kind of streamline it so that you can combine these two storylines into one and you can merge off. Funnily enough, you mentioned L. Ron Hubbard, and he would be more likely to be a composite. But I think I'll find later in the season that actually he's one of the characters who is not a composite. So he will be referred to, I think you might find later on, very much by name.
Oh, okay.
But I think it's kind of, I'm not a screenwriter myself by trade, but I can kind of see why they did it. It's a way of kind of, if you're going to attach a narrative to somebody's life, which, you can say Jack Parsons did this and that and this and the other, but it's very hard to attach that to a 5-season, 10-episode per season kind of show. And I think by having a composite, it allows you a bit more variety. You can choose different aspects of a person's personality. I was a bit off-put as well when I first saw it, but now I kind of see that it actually helps foreground Jack's character in a way. And I think that's the main thing. You kind of want the spirit of Jack Parsons.
Right.
And if some of the other characters, I know it's a shame that Frank Molina isn't there by name, but I think it'll allow Jack Parsons' character to kind of come through all the more clear. I don't know if that makes any sense. But,
no, it does. It does.
That's my best bet.
Well, I mean, with the character of Ernest was basically the gateway for Jack to discover Thelema, in the show, where there isn't. I mean, there are people he's met in his life that were that gateway, but for the sake of a narrative, it's easier if it's just one person.
Yeah, and I think in a way the Ernest character, I know that it's had some blowback from people, who helped me write the book. But in a way, it's a way of externalizing Jack Parsons' internal character to a certain extent. Right. I mean, he seems like Jack's id made flesh.
Right.
He's like in opposition to, and yet part of Jack.
Right.
And
exactly.
so I think what they've done is actually quite a subtle, thing, and it's actually kind of, they've separated Jack's character and put a certain, that kind of drive for belonging and for the occult and everything. And they kind of put it into Ernest's character. So it's a kind of dual character there on screen. And to a certain extent, as we're seeing this season, it's kind of foreshadowing of Jack's own future. I mean, this is totally my own kind of theory on it.
Well, no, yeah.
I was confused by it as well, but the screenwriter is this guy Mark Heyman, who's a very smart guy, and he's written, a couple of very smart, movies. One being what was it, Black Swan? Is that right?
Right.
But he's very good at the kind of psychosis of personality, and I think that's what he's done with Ernest here, and he's really kind of made a psychosis flesh. So that's the way I see Ernest's character. He is the kind of gateway character. In Jack Parsons' real life, he was introduced to the OTO by, a couple of friends of friends, and they really played no further part in his life as far as I can find out. But I think by having Ernest as his gateway, he becomes not just a gateway to the OTO, but he becomes a reflection of Jack's own yearning for the OTO.
Right. And then also, as spoiler alert, guys, it doesn't end well for Jack because there's so much more to explore. Like you mentioned, Cameron, and she herself is a very, very interesting person. Is worthy of her own TV show, quite frankly.
Yes.
Now, the question that I wanted to ask you was there's still the mystery of what happened, and so you have an explosion. I believe it was 1952, and
1952. That's right.
He dies in an explosion. He is said to have been doing a last minute job for a studio, an explosives job. But there's also the whole thing about the gangster that he testified against in the 1930s. That may or may not have come back for revenge. I mean, where do you fall on that? Do you think it was an accident?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you have all this hearsay, which is kind of, the lingering kind of character of Jack Parsons. All that existed was this kind of rumors of his death. Really, when I started writing it, and so there was this idea that he had testified against this corrupt cop who had done all these car bombings in LA, had the corrupt cop, killed him. There was even talk of Howard Hughes. Jack Parsons had worked for some time with Howard Hughes and had Howard Hughes killed him for stealing confidential papers, or was it just an accident while he was making this, or was it some magical ritual gone wrong? But those were the four kind of main theories that came about. I kind of ascribe to the Occam's razor approach, which is like the simplest answer is usually the right one.
Yeah.
And so I kind of thought that, he had been known to sweat a lot. He had been known to take amphetamines, which could make you a little jumpy. He was rushing to get an order done for these, special effects he was making at the end of his life. Such a kind of, a descent from his great rockets to these special effects. But he was rushing to get these done. He had packed up all his proper scientific equipment, and something had gone wrong. I kind of did ascribe to that. But then, funnily enough, when I was offering some tips to the about the screenplays which I was sent about the TV show. You'll notice in the TV show that there's a lot more drug use than I had possibly written in the book. I had, there were rumors that there was drug use, that Jack had been using drugs, but I never got an actual person saying he did coke, he did this or that. A lot of people at the time were using amphetamines. I think that's fair enough.
Right. But
then I was thinking, they show him taking heroin, and it's interesting because I do have. In my book, a quote from one of the people who was living in Jack's coach house when he died, saying that they cleared up loads of needles from a wastebasket after the explosion that killed him. And I originally thought that those needles might have been used in his experiments, like pipettes, kind of dropping in tiny little bits of explosives. But then I was looking into it, and I suddenly was looking through my notes again, and I realized that actually creating heroin, which, was always rumored, but I never had any proof. But it's actually quite dangerous. And as part of the process, if you're slightly careless, you create this kind of volatile ether gas, which can ignite and produce a violent explosion. And this often happens in kind of like, undercover heroin labs. But I suddenly thought, oh my God, it's been 15 years and this other theory has come through. Maybe he was making heroin. Maybe by that point in his life, he was making heroin and it went wrong. So rather than like having the 15 years since the book has been written, rather than actually really finding out or thinking I know what happened, I think it's only got more complicated. I now think I want to add this extra theory to the possibilities that killed him. That he was maybe kind of making his own heroin and he died in an explosion. So I'm not entirely sure. If I had to bet on it, I'd probably say it was an accident, but no one can know except for Jack himself.
Right. Well, I mean, but we hear about drug labs exploding all the time, so that's not not that out of the question, really. Especially when you consider it's not like he had state-of-the-art technology at his disposal that we have today.
No, exactly, and this is an exclusive to your podcast. But I do think it's actually, when you look at the chemistry required to build this, one of the ways of changing morphine into heroin, you use acetic anhydride, which is a chemical which was used by the Germans in World War II as a component for, wait for it, rocket fuel.
Oh boy.
So one of the very chemicals used in rocket fuel is often used in the making of heroin. And it just seems like, he was down on his luck in 1952. He had fallen from a great height. He had lost everything in his professional world. His private world was a complete mess. Who knows if he was taking heroin? It seems definitely he had taken it at some point. But maybe that's what happened. Maybe he was making it and blew up for making it.
Well, you bring up a good point about where he was at the end of his life, because at one point he would have been considered what we consider today a millionaire, based on his work with JPL, the military, and Aerojet. Do you think what ended up as, I guess, a catalyst for his downfall was Helen leaving, or do you think it had more to do with the issue with her sister and L. Ron Hubbard making off with his money?
Well, I think both of those had a big effect on him. I think it was like this, as you'll see in the TV show, and if you read my book, you can see it was like this accumulation of bad luck and bad decisions, which kind of snowballed and overtook his life. I mean, you start with the fact that, he was thrown out of Aerojet and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I mean, he wasn't thrown out, he was bought out. But he was really kind of squeezed out of them both because he was no longer seen as necessary. He had made rocket science, palpable. He had made it real. But from that point on, other scientists could take over. And he wasn't the sort of guy who, could just slip into a white lab coat and spend all day over the Bunsen burner. He liked to experiment. He liked to blow things up. So you take away this professional side of him, and then he leans so heavily into his occult side that I think he puts too much weight on it. Yeah. And then when that falls through, he's left with nothing. There's no platform left, and he's left hovering in the void. Sure. You add L. Ron Hubbard coming along at the worst possible time, stealing his girlfriend, taking his money. you have the FBI involvement, basically tracking down all the members of the early jet propulsion laboratory and, systematically kind of getting rid of them one by one. And, Parsons was swept up in this as well, this scientific blacklist. And you add all these together, the lack of a professional basis, the overwhelming desire to make something work in the occult and it not happening, the loss of his love, the unstable political climate, and it's like a perfect storm for kind of the disintegration of a personality.
Well, you also have being that it was post-World War II, and we were turning our attention to communists, and so he had friends who may have been affiliated with the Communist Party in the 30s and the 40s, and then, of course, once that all started, they got ran out of government work and put on, like you said, blacklist and things like that. So it was just like a perfect storm of events, really.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, yes, Frank Molina and various other members of what they call the Suicide Squad, the early members of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, were members of the Communist Party back in the 30s. But this was a time when Russia was an ally, when communism was just seen as a progressive political cause. It wasn't the great enemy it was after the war. So a lot of these people, really did kind of get swept up, not really because they were spies or even as if they were sympathetic to the communists after the Second World War. It's just from this pre-war kind of affectation for kind of progressive causes. So it was really bad luck in a lot of cases. I mean, the thing was, of course, there were Soviet spies in America working in the scientific establishment at the time, so the FBI wasn't completely wrong. Right. But I think it was a big net which swept up a lot of innocent people in it.
Well, it's similar to the Hollywood, when they were bringing actors in for suspected ties with communism and things like that. That were going on at the same time.
It was not a good time,
No. Well, I mean, any time that you suspect, and I mean, the one thing that I like about the show and your book is that you can see the parallels with today that people have experienced even back then, where you don't know when someone's going to knock on your door and try to question you about whatever, based on whatever the current scare is,
It's very true. No, it's very true. I mean, there is a great, I don't know if moral is the right word, but there's a great warning in Jack Parsons' story, which is that there are people who can help you move forward as a country, as a nation, as a science, or whatever, who aren't necessarily, the people who you would think they would be. They're not like the people in white coats. They're not, all. They don't fit into pigeonholes. Right. And sometimes you need these people who don't fit into pigeonholes to help you move forward, to create new things. You don't get out of your pigeonhole unless you have one of these other people, running around outside thinking crazy ideas.
Right.
And so it's really, if there's any inspiration, which I hope, can be found in Parsons' story, it's that, you need to nurture these people who are outside.
Right.
Just so they can broaden the vision for all of us.
Well, you need your outliers. I mean, you need the closest person for me that we have today that mirrors Jack is probably Elon Musk. Where
that's true. Although
he's a bit kooky.
But
he's a
little more successful too, I think.
Right. Well, I mean, but he doesn't let people tell him what he can't do, right? And his goal is to get us to Mars, which I think if Jack had been able to stay in the industry, probably would have been his next goal is, okay, we got to the moon, because he was a fairly young man when he died. You know,
he was 37.
He was 37, right? So,
which is nothing. He'd done all of his scientific work, before the age of 30. I mean, all his great breakthroughs.
Right.
So, no, I think you're right. I mean, there is a certain kind of Musk-like quality to Jack Parsons, or Parsons-like quality to Elon Musk, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I think the problem was what Elon Musk is doing is basically reinventing the car, and he's also, working with rockets and trying to push it further. But what Parsons did, I think, was he kind of invented the whole science of rocketry.
Correct.
There was no courses before teaching rocketry. There were no, scientists specializing in it.
Right.
He was starting from scratch. And in a way, it feels like, that was a bigger step, it seems. I'm not in any way downplaying what Elon Musk is doing or wanting to do, but I'm saying that kind of Parsons had to make a bigger step, and in a way, he was easier to get rid of once he'd made that step.
Right. Once he laid the groundwork, they didn't need him anymore, and
right, exactly.
It's one of the things that fascinated me about his story is that he taught himself rocketry. He wasn't. I mean, you couldn't go to school for that back when he was doing it.
No.
And he had to figure it out himself. Him, Ed Foreman, and Frank Molina had to basically they had to create a science.
That's right. I mean, they did have one great guide to their work, which was science fiction.
Right.
And that shouldn't be downplayed. I mean, the only people who were talking about rocketry, and sometimes at great length, were the science fiction writers. You think of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, but also all the pulp writers from the 1920s and 30s. People like Jack Williamson or, Robert Heinlein or even L. Ron Hubbard. These were people who were seriously thinking about how could you make a rocket. A lot of them had scientific degrees. So that was the kind of Bible that Parsons worked from. But you're right. I mean, he used those to kind of create the science from scratch. I mean, people thought rockets were delusional at the time.
Right. Well, but I mean, you think that along those lines, science fiction gave us submarines. Science fiction gave us, I mean, for better or for worse, long-range artillery, right, with Earth to the moon.
No, you're right. And I mean, even going to the moon, that's all. The people who went there first were the science fiction writers.
Right. Exactly.
No, I think it's a great prophetic literature, and again, it's something which is kind of downplayed or seen as being kind of juvenile or not necessary, but it's all about sparking that inspiration, like Parsons sparked the inspiration to build rockets. Right. So does sci-fi spark that. And
the most important thing is the spark. I mean, I think that one thing that I think the show conveys, the show, your book, and additional, because more and more productions about Jack Parsons are coming out. It was that Thelema gave him a way to channel what was in his head and bring it out. It wasn't. I mean, of course, we referred to it as a cult, and it was but it was like self-help before self-help was a thing.
No, very much so. I think that's exactly right, and it was also, and it had this parallel kind of vision alongside kind of going into space, which was this kind of improvement of oneself, of leaving one's, base humanity and improving upon it. Rocketry said we're going to leave the world and we're going to go into space, and Thelema, to a certain extent, said we're going to leave humanity as we know it and progress to a greater level of humanity.
Right.
Exactly. And so I think he saw them both as kind of, I try and say this in my book, he saw them as two sides of the same coin. Both, were seen as ridiculous, both were seen as foolish, but both were seen as improving mankind in general. The science of rocketry and the religion of Thelema. So I think for him, you couldn't have one without the other. If you're going to go into outer space, you need to improve yourself as well, right. And vice versa.
Well, and then you also have there's a saying, I forget who said it, but basically science was magic before we figured out what it was.
Right. No, exactly. Yes, I think it was that Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Exactly.
I think
there you go.
He said something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's true. It's true. And Parsons really was. I feel as though he was like the last of the people who could say that with a straight face.
Right.
He was. It's kind of like he was back in the 1930s. Science hadn't quite covered everything completely, and he was in the same way that Isaac Newton, as well as founding all the laws on which physics is based today, was also interested in alchemy. I think Parsons really saw himself as being, I'm interested in rocketry, and I'm interested in Thelema and the occult, in Aleister Crowley's teachings. I think he was the last person who could really see those as indistinguishable, see it on the same spectrum.
Right.
Whereas I think today, if you tried that, science has got so pervasive and has covered so many different bases and is so distinct from anything else, from philosophy, from religion, that I think it would be more difficult today.
Well,
I say he was like, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're 100%. I agree with you 100%. The you have the notion that science is separate from everything now, and
right.
really the way I see it is that science was not meant to disprove the supernatural, is to explain it more so than anything else. Whereas now it's used to debunk what people believe, and it's like, well, you don't really need to do that, to prove a scientific fact. You don't have to, tell these people that they're stupid for what they believe just because you
right.
want to prove. I don't even know if you want to say reality, because reality is eye of the beholder, right?
A tricky concept,
right?
Yeah, no, exactly.
So
no, I think you're right. There's a certain kind of idea of science being, a great kind of explainer rather than a kind of hammer to squash ideas.
Exactly.
And to a certain extent, it feels like it's become the latter, whereas I think we want to kind of embrace the former more.
Right, and it people need wonder in their lives, and I think that's one reason why his story remains intriguing to a lot of people, because he took two really, you would never consider, a scientist going home and trying to conjure elemental that night, right?
Right.
That's not something you think about, but when you hear it, you're like, okay, tell me more.
yeah, right.
Right,
well, I hope that's the case. I mean, I hope it's still the case. I mean, I think the idea is, go into those unexplained corners and go into try the most crazy things. And yes, they may not work, but what if they do?
What if they do? Exactly.
I think that's Parsons' story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What if it works? What if two guys from Pasadena, California, can show us how to get to the moon?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, George, I really, really, really appreciate you doing this with me. It's an amazing book, and I have it on audiobook actually, and I listen to it on repeat. My girlfriend is kind of annoyed with me. But
I apologize.
I tell her that I tell her it's for a good cause.
Okay.
I mean I love the show. I mean, I've seen every episode, and I write about it, and I'm in the Strange Angel group on Facebook, and they're gonna love this interview. So once again, I really appreciate you doing this with me.
Yeah, well, it's been a great pleasure. I love talking about Parsons' story. My main aim in writing the book was to get it more known by people, because I think he was criminally unknown before, and I think that's slowly happening, and I hope the TV show can, aid that. So.
Well, actually, I'm glad you bring that up, because we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, and there's a crater on the moon with his name. But
right.
It's on the dark side of the moon, and except for Pink Floyd, no one really talks about the dark side of the moon. So do you think
very true.
So do you think he'll ever get the same recognition as the people who came later who made that possible?
I don't know. I mean, when I was first writing about it, Caltech were incredibly uninterested in any way recognizing him as part of their heritage. They really had swept him kind of under the launch pad of the whole space program. The very fact that now, when you go online, you can type in Jack Parsons, and there are loads of web pages spring up, which there weren't back in 2003. I think that's great. I don't know if he'll ever be completely embraced by the bosom of the establishment, just because he is the quintessence of anti-establishmentism. So I don't think they can ever do it, and I don't think he would ever want to be embraced by them. But I think the public knowledge of him hopefully will grow and grow, and he'll be kind of like the kind of flip side of Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. There'll be, Jack Parsons on the dark side of the moon.
There you go. That's a great way to end. George, thank you so much for doing this with me. I once again, I really can't thank you enough for taking the time.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Jason. Take care.